Welcome to this week's News Digest from Masters of Supply Chain. I am this week's host, David Warrick, and I'm joined today by my good friend, Dennis Mullahy. Dennis, welcome. Great to see you again.
Nice to see you, David, as always.
So it's been another challenging and interesting week from a supply chain perspective, and we can't get away from this notion of tariffs. It is interesting just to see how companies are reacting, but also to, as earnings season really starts to commence, some of the sound bites that are coming out, people are taking away guidance for the rest of 2025 due to what they class as uncertainty. But also, certain companies are now actually saying this is going to impact us. This is going to hit our profits. This is going to hit our bottom line. And there's that news cycle that's spinning right now. What are you thinking, Dennis? What are you hearing?
Well, I think it's fascinating, David. So, I know you and I have talked about this before, and we've all talked about in supply chain about the need for agility. And if this is not an exercise in agility of tariffs are on, tariffs are off, tariffs are on. I don't know what else is. So we're all learning how to exercise that agility message of that strength of making different decisions. But I think the reality is it is a very hard world to predict anything right now. I mean, 2 days or three, last week tariffs were 145% on China. Today we're talking about, maybe we're going to reduce them, and maybe there's going to be a deal. So there's a lot of things floating around. And I think, as I think about it and what I've advised companies that I've talked to is, we should plan on the tariffs coming. We should plan on the impact that that's going to have. And what it should force us to do is think about, are there ways for us to mitigate those costs? Now, the reality is, right, you're not going to make the tariff costs go away. But if we can mitigate some of the costs, either through negotiations, through cost saving metrics, whatever, then there's an opportunity for us to keep consumption up. If we can't keep consumption up, then we're going to cost cut anyway, because we're going to cost cut down to try to save margin and profit and whatever. And so I do think it is one of those things, like, independent of the tariff and how that plays out. I think it's an opportunity to really kind of, again, reevaluate, are there different ways to do business? Are there things I should be investing in or thinking differently? But it's hard to plan. It's hard to know exactly what is going to come next. And also I would say, David, what's the long-term implications, right? So we may back off all the tariffs, but how much bad will have we created with other countries and partners? It's going to make it more difficult for us in the future to solidify some of those deals. And it's a very interesting time that we're in.
And I do think there's something in that, Dennis, in terms of, short term versus medium term versus long term. And I think that, again, my guidance to companies has been, hurry up and wait, but be prepared to act quickly. And even in the last sort of 10 days, what I've started to see is some, I would call it, supply chain innovation, breaking through. And it's not innovation in its true sense, but it is people starting to, destruct, if you like, their own supply chains and saying, okay, how do we really think about this? What are the things that we can do? And simple things, well, I call them simple, but relatively obvious things like bonded warehousing. So you can continue to import, but you hold your products in that bonded facility, and you're liable for tariffs as you pull them out of that facility. But as you start to ramp up for holiday season, as you start to ramp up for the summer season, and different companies are having to bring in different products with the uncertainty, from a cash flow perspective, it actually helps to not have to now pay the tariffs immediately, in the hope that, as we get these messages, little bits of goodness coming out of the White House, which are, hey, this is unsustainable. We need to strike a better deal. We're going to strike a deal. We're in discussions. Those things just, temper the panic a little bit. But supply chains are starting to become creative again in terms of what they can actually do right now, to stem the flow, if you like. So I'm excited to see that movement even this week, in terms of companies thinking about their supply chain movement of inventory just that little bit differently, and starting to realize that, hey, we don't have to stop everything. We can keep going, but we can actually also protect ourselves a little bit because we know this is going to change.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, to me, it's if I can find ways to do that cost mitigation to try to keep my prices where they are and as opposed to passing it on, I maintain consumption. When the tariffs go away, then I'm just driving profitability, right? And so, but I agree 100%. I mean, I also think it's really interesting because I think it also forces us to um, I mean, I think in general, like most supply chain professionals have always been thinking differently about their network and challenging themselves. But a lot of times we get caught up in the same cost-cutting thing, like how do I drive productivity? How do I lower shipping rates? I think it starts to force conversations around different things, right? And so, like a not so obvious one is inventory productivity. If I could buy less inventory and generate the same amount of sales, I'll have less working capital going out, even with the tariffs coming in. And so, how much can I offset tariff increases by driving better productivity out of the inventory I'm buying, which
Right.
allows me to keep the working capital out, allows me to then maintain better prices, but also all of that inventory not flowing through saves me on expenses, right? And so,
Yeah.
like, starting to think about all of the intricated or integral pieces of the puzzle, how they fit together, how they drive costs amongst or across each other, and then what are some of the ways to go after some of those things. I think it's kind of encouraging to go see. And I love the fact that you've got a lot of, super smart people in startup companies really starting to think through innovation and technology and tools. And I'm excited to see what comes out of this, right? I
Right.
love the quote of, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so how do we how do we start to reimagine, reshape, rethink, some of the tool sets that we use, the ways we cooperate with other companies, integration of supply chains, upstream and down. There's been a lot of, I think way more innovative and interesting conversations on starting to think through some of those things.
No, and that's it's a great point, and like you never let a good crisis go to waste, and I think that like any black swan event or gray swan event, we will see some level of innovation, but it's also going to test supply chains again to say you kind of got a warning signal in 2020. Why didn't you follow through on that? Why didn't you keep that momentum going whenever you saw just how fragile your supply chain architecture actually was? And what stopped you? And so I think it will definitely cause another conversation in the boardroom whereby it's going to be how do we actually protect ourselves? How do we actually make sure that we are prepared for this next wave going forward? Because there will be something else. There will be another thing. We don't know what it is yet, and we can't forecast it, but there for sure will be another thing to hit us.
100%, right? And again, I agree with you. I think that conversation of why did we allow this to kind of atrophy and set aside. And I think boards tend to prioritize some of the sexier things. I want more sales, I want growing business, and yes, we all do, but at the end of the day, I need an infrastructure that's going to be able to support it, grow with it, manage it, and be able to withstand impacts like this. And I think sometimes that gets set aside. I think this is another case to raise that back up in the boardroom of saying, how do we get ourselves in a position? Because I think the clear winners and losers out of all of this is going to be the people who have built the culture, the capabilities, the infrastructure to be able to be nimble enough to react differently when something happens. And so
Right.
it should force more conversations around that, and it should, again, it pushes into kind of the role of supply chain, not just as getting product from point A to point B, but a major financial contributor, a major part of the strategy, a major part of the operations, a major part of how the business is going to be effective, and how do we make sure that we're giving that as much capability as it's required, and thinking about it in ways that allow us to manage cost and again work differently with partners.
And that concept of agility is going to become very important. And it's not just from a supply chain perspective, it's also from a business perspective. And being able to understand from all aspects of the P&L, but also the balance sheet in terms of what are the things that we can do and what are the things that we can't do. And I read a report this morning, Dennis, and it was about why are we not seeing the impact of the tariffs, which I thought was a really interesting title. And it was very focused on shipping. And it kind of said, look, the Port of LA has had a bumper February, a growth spurt in March, and even looks like it's going to be even bigger in April. So what happens next? And the conclusion was this was all front loading of inventory, and they're now going to see a 10% decline in May through the end of the year, which I thought was kind of interesting in terms of, okay, so are we actually seeing that ramp up of inventory? And certain companies, of course, will do it. But there's a seasonality to all of this as well, right? So, when do you start shipping for Halloween? Well, that'll be sometime in June, July, August. When you start shipping for, true holiday season, Black Friday, that's going to be August, September time in traditional retail channels. But, in terms of as we start to see the real impact, it is probably going to start to hit more in May and June. It'll be offset
Yeah.
by some level of seasonality. But, and the question was, well, what are the key indicators? And I'm looking at things like blank sailings. I'm looking at things like, the drop in air freight rates per kilogram. From a supply chain perspective, as you think about it, what are the things that are top of your mind in terms of how do we tell when this actually really starts to bite? Because the consumer will know because of price increases, and you can already see some of that
Yeah.
creeping in. But how does supply chain start to think about that?
I think that's a really good question. And I think it's really hard. I do think we're going to see it really starting to impact May and June. But the other piece of that concern is, so let's assume like I'm February, March, I'm placing Christmas orders for trees or bulbs or things that are extruded plastic that are made in China. Do I place those orders? Like, what do I buy, right? And the
Right.
tariffs may be gone by then, but they also may not be gone by then. And so how do I think about, receipts? Because the reality is, right, if you think about April and product coming in April, those orders were placed in at the earliest January. Most
Right.
likely probably placed sometime last fall after the election, knowing that tariffs might be coming, thinking I'm going to bring inventory in. But when I start getting into, later timeframes, and I start thinking about June, July, August, September, October, December, I'm placing those orders today.
Right.
So if I still believe 145 or 150% tariffs are in place, I'm dropping all my order volume, which is going to drive, again, consumption and everything else, because I don't want to pay the tariffs and I don't want to be stuck with the inventory. And so I think there's a lot to play in there on the longer term impacts of kind of this, oh, hey, we're going to have 145% tariffs. I'm thinking 6 months from now, I'm going to drop my orders. If they go away, then I'm going to be out of inventory. So it's going to be one of two things. I'm either still going to,
Yeah.
I'm going to either going to be heavy or I'm going to be short.
Right.
So I think it's not an immediate switch that gets flipped on and flipped off, right? I think we'll see it start to come in May and June, but even if they go away, the impact of what we've just done is with us for the balance of the year.
Yeah, and that in itself is probably going to drive up prices because to your point, certain companies will have had to pull back looking at the current tariffs and say, well, we don't really have a choice. And it's very difficult to bake bake 145% into anything. It doesn't make an awful lot of sense. But I think that there will be this consumer sentiment piece is going to be really interesting as we start to walk through. And I love what the car companies have already done, beat the tariffs on pricing, and they're already working on that advertising to say, buy now before the tariffs
Right.
really hit. And it's like, okay, there's going to be quite a lot of that happens over the next 4, 5, 6 weeks as well, whereby, it's the start of the summer season. There's a lot of, products that have already been in the country, but now they're going to use this spin on tariff beating pricing. And this is where it gets challenging from a consumer perspective because they're trying to figure out what are they really paying for? Are they really absorbing the tariff, or are they actually beating the time frame on this at all?
Right, right. And again, with the uncertainty of whether the tariffs are going to be there, but and again, right, I mean, summer season tends to be the lowest. right? Outside
Yeah.
of home improvement and gardening and stuff like that. It tends to be the lowest in retail in particular. It'll start to pick back up in the fall, but if I've already changed my order quantities for what's coming in the fall with anticipation of the tariff. So you can play two scenarios. If we assume the tariffs go away, now I'm going to have limited supply. What happens when I have limited supply? I'm going to increase prices because I can,
Right.
because
Yep.
demand's going to be there. And so no matter what, inflation happens, right? You've created a scenario where there's zero probability that there aren't cost increases, at least on certain products, because of decisions that were made on how to manage production in right now today, not knowing what's coming in the future because there's no way to know, right? And so
Yeah.
it, it's it's an interesting time. I also would say I think the other challenge that's coming up on top of tariffs is this idea of incremental port charges to Chinese vessels,
Right. Yeah.
which again, right, all that's going to do is they're going to say, I'm going to land at less ports. So now instead of hitting, all up and down the West Coast, I'm going to go to LA. I'm going to have one port, which means we're just going to back up LA, and then we're going to delay goods coming in, and then we're going to create another piece of gridlock on the supply chain side of it for that. And so I think all of these things start to come together on availability of product, cost of product, congestion. How do we respond to it? What do we do if we go forward with the port charges, if the tariffs stay in place, if they don't? There's a lot of moving pieces, and I think again, like we've talked a lot, and I jokingly said at the beginning, agility is our best friend. The
Yeah.
better that we can make, decisions close in on how to handle it, and react to it, and the better we can think about ways to protect ourselves going forward so that when issues like this come up, we have other alternatives that are cost advantageous to us or not as cost negative, really starts to change the way you think about, your network.
And it is, look, it's a super interesting point. The fact that irrespective of whether, if tariffs were to go away tomorrow, which they won't, but if they even were to go away or reduce significantly tomorrow, even in the last 4 or 5 weeks, there has been significant repercussions because of those early statements, and we will not really feel those repercussions most likely until later on in the year.
Right.
But that's going to be another opportunity or challenge for supply chain because it is, okay, I've cut my orders back because of the tariffs because I don't think I can sell at these prices. Oh, the journey's now changed. Now I need more. So now we're going to push even more demand on manufacturing, which is going to lead to even more demand on shipping. And so we're going to have another set of fluctuations if the tariffs are to reduce. So it's an interesting, dichotomy of you are a little bit damned if you do and damned if you don't. And that's the cycle that we're in right now.
Right. Well, and it creates this whipsaw, right? So, if you think about apparel, in particular, right? I'm placing an apparel order 6 months in advance, right? Somebody's got to go. Someone's got to get the yarn. I've got to make the fabric. I've got to dye the fabric, cut it, sew it, ship it, all this stuff. So minimum, you're talking 6 months. So let's assume you're on a 6 month time frame. What I ordered in fall, I've placed. If now
Right.
all of a sudden fall volume is going up, there aren't goods available for me to go get. I'm 6 months away. So now I can think about it and go, well, do I then jack up my production for spring because I'm so low right now? And then so now I'm in this whipsaw event of I'm low, then I'm high, then I'm low, then I'm high. And like getting that rebalancing, where your supply is to your demand and the time frame and the lead time that it takes to get your supply in to support that demand, it's going to become really tricky and challenging and put a lot of pressure on supply chain because I may be low now, so I'm going to have scarcity of product, which means I'm going to have delivery issues and shipping challenges and movement and getting all this and managing my costs. So all that's going to be interesting to manage through. Then if I go the other direction where now I'm like, okay, well, we've really got an opportunity because we missed all of these sales. And so let's be opportunistic. I buy spring way up. Now I've got, where am I going to put it all? What's my capacity
Right.
going to look like? Where's all that going to go? And then if I don't sell through it, I've got an inventory problem. And so it's this very cyclical thing that, I think a lot of people think about, product from a, somebody just made that yesterday for me today. Like
Yeah.
as a
Just in
retailer,
time. Yeah.
yeah, you're buying product, you know, 30, 60, 90, 120 days, sometimes a year in advance when you're talking, design development and all those other things. And so you've got orders out there that are out there. And it doesn't just materialize when you're like, oh, hey, I need more. There is no more.
Right.
And so I think the inventory side of it and the whipsawing between, being out, being too much, where do I put all this excess capacity, utilization? That's going to be a really fascinating journey for people to go through of how do I maintain utilization in low productivity, but then not exceed utilization in, times when I'm stuffed.
And it does lead back to your point on agility, which is, fundamentally supply chains are built on consistency. They're built within, parameters, and whenever volumes go outside of those parameters is when it becomes challenging and it becomes costly. And yet we kind of knew this was coming, and we had the lessons learned from 2020, but we still haven't really embraced that agility. Now, technology will play a key role in that for sure, but it's another sort of philosophical back step to say, why do we keep doing this in the same way, expecting a different result? The supply chains have to be more complex. They have to be more agile to enable the consumer fulfillment part of this, as we get hit with these continual waves.
Yeah, and I also wonder, and I'm curious your perspective on this, David. Um, I think I wonder how much it shifts the paradigm and the thinking about a supply chain. So in general, right, every organization runs a supply chain. Everybody has their pieces of it, right? At retailers, I'm buying products, storing them, moving them, shipping them. Manufacturers are buying product, consumer products, goods are making product, holding them, shipping them. At what point does it start to change the paradigm and really get into, what we've talked about for many, many decades is a true notion of a more integrated supply chain where I'm leveraging components of my manufacturer's supply chain in a different way than I am today to eliminate components of my supply chain. So if I reduce nodes and I reduce, the number of places product has to go, do I create a situation where I've been able to reduce costs, and have I gained agility or have I lost it? So I just wonder, like, as you think about like the vast majority of, hundreds and thousands of companies managing their own supply chain versus integration of multiple companies in a consolidated supply chain that has more opportunity to shift and move and change because of the vast number of resources I'm deploying against a larger scale. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And again, I think that, like every other major event, I think that this has to now, spur that level of thinking to say we can't keep doing the same thing the same way. It's a little bit like the AI question, which is AI is not just about automating spreadsheets. It's much deeper than that. And so it's doing old things in new ways. It's interesting, but it's not really innovation. Events like this, and when you start to understand again the fragility of your supply chain and the challenges that you face, it is the absolute pivotal moment to start to think differently. And that's what, I started earlier by saying, I think it's time for people to break down their supply chains again. And that's not to say, let's throw everything out and start with a blank sheet of paper, but it is to start to deconstruct some of the ways that we have enabled the problem that we are now in. And part of that is not thinking along those broader lines of, what does consolidation really mean? What does agility really mean? And how do I think about that decentralized supply chain? And we only do it within the parameters of what we've always done. There's very little innovative thinking in terms of saying, well, but what if we were to really think again and say, is there a better way to do this? Is there a better way to think about leveraging manufacturing versus logistics versus freight versus order management? and ultimately start to create the supply chain that fulfills the customer need, as opposed to just being another cost center to move boxes. And
Right.
so I think that this is another one of those pivotal moments, Dennis. It's just sometimes hard in the heat of the moment to be able to free up enough brain power to be able to say it is a time to rethink, as opposed to I got to get my job done today.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I also think I like your comment on deconstructing the supply chain again, because I do think that's important. But I think the one thing I would say to it my encouragement would be, as we deconstruct the supply chain within every function, I would start to think about, how do I start to have conversations with my partners on their deconstructed supply chain, and where can I find advantages, right? Because again, right, if I'm running a company that has 10 facilities, you're running a company that has 10 facilities, and you're supplying to me, and we go, geez, between us, we would both have more power if we ran one supply chain with 15, points of
Right.
distribution instead of 10 each. Then we've eliminated five. We're both saving money. And guess what? We've also gained five, because neither one of us had 15 to begin with. Like, how that conversation starts to evolve and starts to think about, the deconstruction of the supply chain, not just within the confines of my business, but within the confines of my partner's businesses. And how do I start to link those things together, right? And so, there's always the conversation. I remember back when there was trucking issues and people were having a hard time getting trucks. And
Right.
so I had the luxury of having different contracts, and we were actually pretty good at being able to manage our transportation. So there were times when I would leverage my transportation contracts to go pick stuff up that I wasn't supposed to go pick up. And then you're kind of like, well, hey, we just did that cheaper. Why don't we do that all the time, right? And how do you start to, take advantage of some of those things, or think differently about those? And, what's the bridge to start to do that, to create this more agile, competitive, resilient, you know, integrated supply chain across partners, and that really allows you to leverage a larger scale at a lower cost.
Dennis, we're touching on something here which is fundamental. Um, we're not going to cancel Christmas just yet. We've
No,
still got a few months left to go. Thank you so much for joining me today. For everybody watching, if you like our content, please give us a thumbs up and follow us. If you don't, reach out and we'll change it. Thank you so much, Dennis. Great to see you.
thanks, David. It was great to see you as well. Have a great week.
You too.